The autumn wind carried a sharp bite that 12th day of October in 1944, sweeping across the grey waters of the Atlantic and into the harbour where the SS Bremen had finally come to rest after weeks of crossing. The vessel's hull bore the marks of its journey, rust bleeding through the paint in long streaks that spoke of salt water and time. Standing on the deck, pressed together against the chill, were 47 women who had worn German uniforms until their capture. They had been pulled from the battlefields of France and Belgium, from towns whose names they would rather forget, from a Reich that was slowly crumbling, though they did not yet fully understand how completely. Their coats were thin, inadequate for the weather, and they clutched them close as the ship eased into its berth with a groaning of metal against wood. These women had been fed a steady diet of stories back home, tales spun by officers and reinforced through every broadcast and newspaper. America, they had been told repeatedly, was a nation grown soft from luxury, a place where people lacked the discipline for true warfare, where the factories were few and the workers lazy. The propaganda had painted a picture of a country collapsing under its own weight, unable to sustain a real fight. As the gangplank lowered and the harbour spread out before them in all its chaotic glory, that carefully constructed image began to crack like thin ice under a boot. Sound hit them first, before they even set foot on American ground. The air itself seemed to vibrate with industry. Hammers struck steel plates in a rhythm that never faltered, creating a metallic chorus that rang out across the water like the bells of some vast mechanical cathedral. Diesel engines coughed and rumbled, spewing black exhaust into the grey sky as cranes lifted enormous crates, containers large enough to house entire families, swinging them through the air and lowering them onto rail cars that stretched in lines, disappearing into the distance. The smell was almost physical in its intensity, a mixture of hot tar and machine grease, of brine and burning coal, of paint and rubber, and something else they couldn't quite identify, but which spoke of constant motion and endless work. One of the women, a former technician named Ingrid, who kept a diary hidden in her coat pocket, would later write that they had expected to find a harbour quiet with neglect, perhaps a few ships, perhaps empty docks. Instead, what stretched before them was a scene more crowded with vessels than anything Hamburg had shown in its finest peacetime years. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. They were prisoners, captured auxiliaries and technicians who had believed they understood warfare, who had been trained to see the world through the lens their government provided. Yet before their boots even touched American soil, before they took their first steps onto enemy territory, they were confronted with evidence that shattered their understanding. The Norfolk Yard alone, they would learn, employed more than 40,000 people, men and women working around the clock in shifts that never stopped. Liberty ships, those cargo vessels that had become the workhorses of the Allied war effort, were being launched every 4 days from this single location. By the time the war ended, American shipyards would have produced 2,710 of them, a number that dwarfed everything Germany had managed to construct during the entire conflict. The scale was not just impressive, it was incomprehensible to minds trained to work with scarcity. A lieutenant from the US Navy stood waiting at the bottom of the gangplank, his uniform crisp despite the weather, his expression formal without being cruel. He maintained a professional distance, a courtesy that somehow felt more unsettling than hostility would have been. The women descended one by one, their boots making hollow sounds against the wooden planks, their eyes unable to rest on any single thing because there was too much to process. Soldiers stood at ease in neat rows, not threatening but present, a reminder of order. Behind them stretched an endless background of machinery, of cranes reaching toward the sky, of cargo nets filled with supplies, of ships in various stages of construction, their ribs exposed or their hulls nearly complete. The silence among the German women was heavy, broken only by the shuffle of their feet and the relentless percussion of the shipyard's work. For the Americans conducting their routine duties, this was just another day, just another group of prisoners to be processed and moved through the system. For the women stumbling down onto the dock, it was the first of many revelations that would fundamentally alter what they believed about the war and their place in it. They began noticing details, small things that accumulated into a larger picture. A convoy of trucks sat nearby, engines idling, and even from a distance they could see that the fuel tanks were full, that there was no panic about conserving gasoline. The trucks themselves looked new, their tarpaulins unstained and properly fitted. Pallets of uniforms stood stacked waist-high along the dock, fresh fabric in olive drab and navy blue, more clothing in one pile than entire German units might see in months. These women had lived through years of rationing, had grown accustomed to making do with ersatz coffee and thin soups, had learned to save every scrap of soap and to carefully portion out sugar. To see such casual abundance, supplies sitting in the open air as though they were unlimited, as though there would always be more where that came from, created a cognitive dissonance that was almost painful. One prisoner, her voice barely audible over the noise of the harbour, whispered in German that this could not be possible, that what they were seeing must be some kind of elaborate deception. Another woman tightened her grip on her scarf as though trying to anchor herself against something more dangerous than the October wind, some force that threatened to upend everything she thought she knew about the world. What made it worse was the realization that none of this was staged. No one had arranged this display for their benefit. No American officer had carefully positioned the ships and the cranes and the supplies to create an impression. This was simply how things were, the normal daily operation of a nation at war. That fact, the casual nature of it all, unsettled them more profoundly than any propaganda film or carefully orchestrated tour ever could have. A Red Cross observer, a woman in a clean uniform who had been assigned to ensure the prisoners received humane treatment, made notes in her leather-bound journal as she watched the German women process what they were seeing. She wrote that the prisoners seemed disoriented, but not in the way one might expect from people who had just endured weeks at sea or who were facing an uncertain future in captivity. Rather, they appeared shaken by their arrival itself, by the evidence of industrial capacity that surrounded them before they had even officially become American prisoners. The docks themselves, the observer noted in careful handwriting, appeared to communicate a form of power that transcended military force, a power rooted in production and resources that seemed bottomless. As the women were guided toward a line of waiting buses, their necks craned upward for one final view of the horizon. Ship masts and smokestacks punctured the sky in such density that they resembled a forest of iron and steel, a mechanical woodland that stretched as far as they could see. The image burned itself into their memories, becoming one of those moments that would resurface in dreams and quiet reflections for years to come. But this initial shock at the Norfolk docks was merely the beginning of their education. The journey inland that awaited them would carry them deeper into the industrial heartland of the United States, past evidence even more staggering than what they had witnessed at the harbour. With every mile the buses travelled, with every town and factory they passed, the gap between what they had been taught to believe and what their own eyes confirmed would grow wider and more impossible to bridge. The convoy departed Norfolk shortly after midday, flanked by a pair of military jeeps whose olive paint matched the buses. The vehicles rattled along the coastal highway, their windows streaked with dried salt from the sea air, creating patterns that caught the afternoon light. Inside the buses, the German women maintained an uneasy silence, though their eyes remained fixed on the landscape rolling past. They had braced themselves for scarcity and emptiness. Instead, mile after mile revealed an arsenal that seemed to have no end, an industrial capacity that overwhelmed their ability to process what they were witnessing. The first major shock arrived within minutes of leaving the harbour complex. More shipyards appeared, stretching for city blocks, their gantries reaching toward the grey sky like the skeletal fingers of giants. Smoke and steam rose in columns from welding operations, and even through the closed bus windows they could see the cascades of sparks falling like artificial rain as workers fused metal plates together. Liberty ships stood in various stages of completion, some reduced to nothing more than frameworks of ribs and crossbeams, Others so nearly finished that they looked ready to slide into the water at any moment. A young woman who had served as a signals officer, someone who had studied naval tonnage tables and production figures as part of her training, whispered in disbelief that a single yard in this American city was producing more hulls than all of Kiel combined. The numbers, when examined later, would prove her instinctive assessment correct. Norfolk alone was responsible for dozens of destroyers, aircraft carriers, and auxiliary vessels by 1944. Across the entire United States, shipyards were producing 18 million tons of shipping annually, a figure that represented 6 times Germany's total wartime output. The rhythm of hammers striking metal and rivet guns firing their fasteners echoed through the bus windows like an industrial heartbeat, steady and inexorable and utterly overwhelming in its implications. As the convoy continued inland, the landscape transformed from maritime facilities to manufacturing centres. Smokestacks punctuated every horizon they could see. Warehouses sprawled across what must have been hundreds of acres, their walls painted with names the women recognized only dimly from intercepted documents and intelligence briefings they had seen before their capture. Ford, DuPont, Bethlehem Steel. The names themselves seemed to carry weight, representing entities whose scale they were only beginning to grasp. One prisoner, speaking softly to avoid being overheard by the guards, later described the experience as feeling that every town they passed through was actually a military barracks in disguise, that every street functioned as a supply line, that they had finally understood the newspapers back home had been feeding them lies. This was not a soft nation distracted by consumer goods and creature comforts. This was a country that had transformed itself into a machine designed for a single purpose. The paradox deepened with every passing mile. The roads themselves became part of the revelation, another piece of evidence they could not ignore. Highways carried endless streams of trucks loaded with crates and machinery, with tank parts and spare components. Gasoline, that precious resource that had become so scarce in Germany that doctors were forced to make house calls on bicycles, flowed freely here in quantities that seemed obscene. The convoy slowed at one point due to traffic, and the women could smell it through the ventilation. That sharp, sweet scent of petrol fumes hanging in the warm autumn air, speaking of abundance they could barely comprehend. One of the bus drivers, a sergeant named James Foster, who had been assigned to transport duty after an injury removed him from combat service, chuckled when he overheard a prisoner gasp at the sight of a depot where hundreds of trucks stood lined up nose to tail, waiting for assignment. He muttered something under his breath about how this represented only a fraction of what was moving on American roads at any given moment. To him, raised in a country where automobile ownership was common even before the war, the sight was utterly mundane. To the German women pressed against the bus windows, it was evidence of a logistical capacity that their own military could only dream about achieving. At a rest stop outside Newport News, the buses idled beside a sprawling rail yard where the real scale of American transportation infrastructure became visible. Long lines of boxcars and flatbed cars stretched in every direction, each one marked with white chalk indicating its destination. Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis. Names of cities they knew from maps but could not picture, places so far inland that the distances involved seemed to defy imagination. Cranes loaded crates marked with serial numbers, working with a precision and efficiency that left the women feeling unsettled. In the Reich, especially by 1944, chaos had become the norm. Bombing raids disrupted shipments constantly, forcing supply officers to improvise and adapt on the fly. Shortages meant that priorities shifted daily. Here, the logistics appeared clean and orderly, operating with a mechanical regularity that suggested deep reserves and careful planning. The prisoners exchanged glances across the aisle of the bus, silently taking inventory of what they were witnessing. Several of them were trained analysts, women whose value to Berlin had come from their ability to read industrial capacity from limited information, to extrapolate production figures from partial data. What they were seeing now, the frequency of train departures, the sheer volume of materials being moved, the careful stockpiling of goods in protected warehouses, all of it suggested an enemy whose resources not only dwarfed their own, but operated on a completely different scale of organization. One woman pulled out a small notebook, the kind that prisoners were allowed to keep for personal use, and began scribbling observations. The notebook would later be recovered and analysed, and in it she had written a line that captured the growing realisation among the group. She wrote that they had been taught to think of America as a nation of consumers, people who wanted comfort and ease. What they were discovering instead was that America was fundamentally a nation of producers, capable of manufacturing at a scale that turned the war into a mathematical certainty rather than a contest of wills. Every factory they passed, she wrote, felt like another nail being driven into a coffin. And yet, paradoxically, no one seemed to be making a show of this abundance. American civilians went about their daily lives along the route with no apparent awareness that they were being observed by enemy prisoners. Workers in coveralls walked to their shifts, children played ball games in yards near the road, women carried paper bags of groceries from markets that appeared well stocked. There was no visible sense of strain or imminent collapse, none of the hollow-eyed exhaustion that had become the defining characteristic of German cities in 1944. Instead, vitality seemed to radiate from the very streets and buildings. The prisoners found themselves unable to reconcile this reality with what they had been told. How could a nation wage a global war while still feeding its population adequately, while still clothing them in clean garments, while still maintaining infrastructure and building new roads and bridges as though peacetime had never been interrupted? By the time the convoy approached the outskirts of Richmond as evening began to fall, the women had lapsed into a silence that felt different from the uncertain quiet of the morning. The initial shock of the harbour had given way to something deeper and more troubling, a gnawing realisation that what they had witnessed in the span of a single afternoon represented more industrial output than Germany could manage in a year of maximum effort. Their faith in the propaganda that had sustained them, the repeated assurances that America was soft and incapable and too divided to sustain a real war effort, was dissolving like frost under the Virginia sun, melting away to reveal a landscape they had not been prepared to see. But their journey of discovery was far from complete. Ahead lay the prisoner of war camps themselves, the processing centres where paradoxically their captors would demonstrate a level of care and dignity that flew in the face of everything they expected. And in that treatment, in the contrast between what they received and what they knew was happening to Allied prisoners in German hands, another revelation awaited them, one that would prove just as disorienting as the shipyards and factories they had already witnessed. The buses turned off the main highway as dusk began to settle over the landscape, their tyres crunching over gravel as they approached a sprawling compound surrounded by barbed wire fencing. The women braced themselves internally, calling up mental images of what prison camps should look like based on their training and the stories they had heard. They expected filth and overcrowding, expected brutality, or at least harsh indifference. German propaganda had consistently painted American prisoner facilities as barely better than cages, places where captured soldiers were left to suffer. As the gates swung open on well-oiled hinges and the buses rolled into the compound, yet another paradox revealed itself before their exhausted eyes. The barracks that spread out before them resembled a university campus more than a prison. Neat rows of wooden buildings stood in orderly lines, their roofs properly tarred against weather damage, their windows intact. Smoke curled upward from several chimneys, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of baking bread from a nearby mess hall. Beyond the residential buildings stretched small gardens that had been tended with care and a field marked out for recreational activities. One woman, a nurse named Hildegard, who had treated wounded soldiers in field hospitals before her capture, muttered an oath under her breath. She could not believe what she was seeing. The thought crossed her mind that prisoners here lived in better conditions than German soldiers currently stationed at the front. Inside the main processing centre, the shock only deepened. Each prisoner was assigned an identification number, photographed under even lighting, and issued fresh bedding that still smelled faintly of soap and sunshine. Then came the medical examination, conducted with a thoroughness that surprised them. Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, a Navy physician with greying hair and competent hands, moved through the examinations with brisk professionalism. She checked their teeth, listened to their lungs with a cold stethoscope, noted signs of malnutrition that appeared in nearly every case. Through an interpreter, she explained matter-of-factly that the women had been surviving on approximately 1,200 calories per day, maybe less. American servicemen, she added without any particular emphasis, received double that amount even when serving in field conditions. For the German women, the contrast was humiliating in a way they had not anticipated. Back in the Reich, rations had been steadily dwindling since 1940. By this point in the war, civilians were making do with thin slices of black bread, ersatz coffee made from roasted grains that bore only a passing resemblance to the real thing, and watery stews stretched thin with turnips and potatoes. Here in captivity, even prisoners were being measured for properly fitting shoes and vaccinated against preventable diseases. Ingrid pulled out her hidden diary that evening and wrote that their captors treated them like patients rather than enemies, and she found the experience to be simultaneously an insult and a mercy, two emotions that sat uncomfortably side by side. The paradox extended beyond food and medical care. That first evening, the women were led to their assigned barracks where clean cots with actual wool blankets awaited them. Soap and towels had been stacked in neat piles near the communal washroom. A Red Cross representative, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and patient demeanour, explained through the interpreter that under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were entitled to basic dignity and humane treatment. The German women stared in frank disbelief. Their own government had been a signatory to those same conventions, had agreed to the same international standards, yet they knew that Soviet prisoners in German hands were starving in open fields, that French captives were worked to exhaustion on minimal rations, that the Reich had systematically ignored every provision designed to protect captured soldiers. The statistics, when examined objectively, told a stark story. In American camps, German prisoners received an average of 3,500 calories daily, more food than many US civilians were getting under wartime rationing programs. In German camps, Allied prisoners frequently survived on fewer than 1,000 calories, slowly wasting away. One prisoner confessed in a hushed whisper to her bunkmate, worried that her words might somehow be overheard and reported, that if the people back home in Berlin knew the truth about how well they were surviving in captivity, they might never be forgiven for it. The sensory details of that first evening etched themselves permanently into memory. The smell of clean sheets, a scent they had almost forgotten existed. The taste of white bread and actual butter served at supper, luxuries that had disappeared from German tables years ago. The sound of stainless steel cutlery clinking against ceramic plates. All of these were symbols of a plenty that seemed to mock the deprivation they had left behind. In one corner of the mess hall, a prisoner broke down in tears after biting into an orange, a fruit she had not seen or tasted since before the war began. She whispered to no one in particular that to them, to German civilians living under constant shortage, this single piece of fruit represented a luxury beyond reason. Yet the treatment they received was not simple indulgence or some kind of misguided kindness. It was discipline of a different sort. Guards maintained order firmly, and escape attempts were not tolerated. Rules were enforced consistently. But the civility itself functioned as its own form of weapon, a subtle demonstration of American confidence. As one US officer remarked to a colleague within earshot of the prisoners, not caring whether they understood his English or not, America could afford to treat its prisoners well precisely because it was not afraid of them, because the outcome of the war was no longer in serious doubt. The women lay awake that first night in their new bunks, listening to the low electrical hum of generators providing power to the compound and the distant occasional bark of guard dogs on patrol. For some of them, it represented the first uninterrupted night of rest they had experienced in months, the first time they could close their eyes without worrying about air raids or artillery fire. For others, the comfort itself became a form of torment. To be shown humanity by the people they had been taught to think of as the enemy made it increasingly difficult to justify the brutality they knew their own side was inflicting. The contradiction gnawed at them as they drifted toward an uneasy sleep. But what they had witnessed so far, the overwhelming industrial capacity at the harbour, the endless highways filled with supplies, the well-maintained barracks and the ample food, was only scratching the surface of America's power. In the days ahead, they would begin to hear something that would prove even more disorienting. Voices would crackle across open radio frequencies and telephone lines, revealing a coordination and communication network that seemed to defy imagination, a web of information that connected every corner of this vast nation in ways they had not thought possible. The morning routine in the camp began with a bugle call that cut sharply through the autumn air, rousing the prisoners from sleep with military precision. After breakfast, a meal of scrambled eggs and toast accompanied by coffee that actually tasted like the real thing rather than a pale substitute, the women were escorted into a large common hall they had not been permitted to enter the night before. There, for the first time since their capture, they encountered something they had been repeatedly told could not exist in a functional form. They heard the open pulse of American communications, the beating heart of a network that connected the entire country. Radios hummed with carrier waves, telephones rang in steady succession, and the persistent clatter of typewriters filled the air with a sound like mechanical rain. For women who had been trained in signal work, who understood radar systems and logistics communication, the soundscape itself carried meaning. They leaned forward unconsciously, their ears sharpening to pick up details. Through the static of a shortwave radio set came voices speaking in clipped English, discussing weather updates from somewhere called Kansas, relaying shipping manifests from New Orleans, coordinating naval traffic movements off what they presumed was the Pacific coast based on the time references being used. What struck them as truly astonishing was not simply the breadth of information flowing through these channels, but how remarkably unguarded it all seemed. One of the German women, a former radio operator named Lotta who had spent 2 years manning communications posts before her capture, whispered to her neighbour that the Americans did not even bother to encrypt most of this traffic, that they broadcast details to the world because they possessed the confidence that came from knowing they could afford to be overheard. In the Reich, secrecy had been elevated to an obsession. Telephone lines were monitored constantly, codes were layered upon codes, paranoia governed every transmission because resources were limited and any advantage had to be protected at all costs. Here, the openness felt simultaneously confusing and terrifying in its implications. A US Army sergeant, noticing the rapt attention the women were paying to the communication equipment, walked over and explained in simple terms through the interpreter. He told them this was just routine administrative traffic, that the United States operated thousands of radio stations and telephone exchanges, that every state and military base and naval vessel maintained constant contact. He shrugged as he spoke, as though describing something completely unremarkable, the way one might comment on the weather. But for the prisoners listening to his words, the implications were staggering. Germany's communications network, fragmented by bombing campaigns and crippled by constant shortages of equipment and trained personnel, could barely maintain reliable contact across its shrinking empire. The idea that America could casually coordinate activities from coast to coast, that information flowed freely without the constant fear of disruption, spoke to a level of infrastructure they had not imagined possible. The women were informed that under Red Cross supervision, they would be permitted to send letters home to their families. Some of them even had the opportunity to dictate messages to American clerks who typed them out on clean stationery using machines that worked smoothly without jamming. Ingrid recorded in her diary later that evening that the simple act of touching a telephone, of watching a letter being prepared for international transmission, made her feel as though she had returned to civilization after a long exile. And yet, she added with obvious confusion, this freedom and efficiency was exactly what they had been taught to despise, What propaganda had told them represented weakness rather than strength. The paradox cut sharply both ways. Their captors' generosity, the ease with which they operated their systems, highlighted by contrast the bankruptcy of the promises their own regime had made. Germany had claimed it would build a new order, that discipline and sacrifice would lead to victory. Instead, what the women were experiencing was that their enemy possessed both greater resources and a more functional society, one that could wage a massive war while still maintaining the basic operations of peacetime. The sensory experience reinforced these lessons constantly. The steady buzz of switchboards as operators connected calls. The metallic snap of plugs being inserted into jacks with practiced efficiency. The constant whir of teletype machines feeding paper through their mechanisms, printing out messages at speeds that seemed impossible. It created a symphony of efficiency, a background noise that spoke of coordination and planning operating at scales they were only beginning to comprehend. The women slowly realized that this invisible infrastructure of communication was as decisive a weapon as any tank or bomber, that wars were no longer won solely through superior firepower, but through the ability to coordinate vast operations across enormous distances. Hildegard, the nurse who had broken down at the site of the camp facilities, later confessed in an interview conducted years after the war ended that she had believed America was fundamentally disorganized and lazy, lacking the discipline necessary for sustained military operations. Instead, what she witnessed was that even American voices had order, that even casual conversations between operators followed protocols that ensured information reached its destination reliably. The war, she came to understand, lived in every telephone line and every radio wave. It was inescapable and all-encompassing, but the Americans were not showing off or staging demonstrations for the prisoners' benefit. To the personnel operating these systems, this was simply routine administration, the background work that kept military operations functioning. The very normalcy of it rattled the prisoners more profoundly than any deliberate display of power could have. If this was the ambient noise of a single processing camp in Virginia, what must the full communications network of the United States sound like when operating at full capacity? The thought was almost too large to hold in their minds. That evening, as the women returned to their barracks under armed escort, the paradox weighed on them with almost physical force. They had been captured soldiers, trained auxiliaries of the Reich, and they had expected humiliation and harsh treatment. Instead, they were being given glimpses of a system so vast and so well coordinated that it could operate with apparent casualness. For Germany, secrecy had always functioned as armor, a way to protect limited resources and hide weaknesses. For America, transparency seemed to be its own form of strength, a confidence that came from knowing that even if the enemy understood your capabilities, they lacked the means to match them. Soon, the proof of that strength would become even more tangible and impossible to deny. Their next phase of education would take them into aircraft hangars, where the scale of American air power would be measured not in distant radio signals or abstract telephone conversations, but in steel wings and roaring engines that shook the ground beneath their feet, in machines being produced at rates that would shatter what remained of their illusions about the war's inevitable outcome. The first sensation that hit them as they approached the hangar complex was olfactory, a thick mixture of oil and rubber and gasoline so potent that it seemed to coat the inside of their throats and cling to their clothing long after they had departed. The convoy of buses pulled up alongside an enormous corrugated metal structure, its doors yawning open like the entrance to some colossal metallic cave. Inside, wings gleamed under banks of overhead electric lamps, engines hung suspended from heavy cranes, and teams of mechanics swarmed over aluminum fuselages with a precision that looked almost choreographed, as though they had rehearsed these movements 1,000 times. For the German women, most of whom had been raised hearing tales of Luftwaffe superiority and German engineering excellence, the sight triggered a fundamental shock to their understanding. In their minds, German aircraft like the Messerschmitt and the Junkers and the Focke-Wulf still represented the pinnacle of aviation technology, machines that no enemy could truly match in quality or sophistication. Yet here stood rows upon rows of American bombers and fighters, not hidden away in some secret underground facility where precious resources were hoarded and protected, but arrayed openly in the afternoon light by the dozens, perhaps by the hundreds, as though they were consumer goods rather than weapons of war. A sergeant named Michael O'Brien, a cheerful Irish-American with perpetual grease stains on his sleeves and no apparent sense that he was revealing military secrets, had been assigned to escort the prisoners through the facility. He walked them down the length of the hangar floor with an easy stride, occasionally stopping to slap the metal flank of a B-24 Liberator with obvious affection. "This particular bird right here," he explained through the interpreter, "could be completely replaced within 3 days if it went down in combat." 3 days, ladies. That is precisely how fast these machines roll off the production lines in this country. He said it with the casual pride of someone stating an obvious fact, without any understanding of how those words landed on German ears like physical blows. 3 days to replace a heavy bomber. The concept was almost impossible for them to process. In Germany, by late 1944, aircraft factories were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing raids. Spare parts had become desperately scarce, with supply officers forced to cannibalize damaged planes just to keep others flying. Some aircraft sat grounded for weeks, waiting for a single component to be manufactured or transported. The idea that a lost bomber was simply a line item to be refilled, that the replacement cycle could be measured in days rather than months, staggered them with its implications for the war's trajectory. The raw numbers supported O'Brien's casual boast in ways that made the reality even more crushing. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft of all types. That single year's production exceeded what Germany had managed to build during the entire duration of the war from its beginning in 1939. At the peak of American production, a new plane was rolling off assembly lines somewhere in the country every 5 minutes of every hour of every day. The contrast was not merely significant, it was obscene in its scale, representing an industrial capacity that operated in a different realm entirely. The sensory details of the hangar drove the revelation home in ways that abstract statistics could not. The rhythmic pounding of rivet guns echoed through the cavernous space like sustained machine gun fire, except instead of destroying, they were creating, building power rather than dismantling it. The air shimmered with heat from arc welders, making distant objects waver as though seen through water. Mechanics shouted instructions to one another over the constant roar of test engines being fired up and tuned, their voices barely audible above the industrial symphony. The floor itself seemed to vibrate constantly with the accumulated energy of all this activity, a physical sensation that entered through their feet and resonated in their bones. Lotte, the radio operator whose training had taught her to assess technical capacity, muttered repeatedly as they walked between aircraft. "So many," she kept saying, "so many, and still more being produced." Her voice trembled not from fear of the American guards surrounding them, but from the sheer crushing realization of what industrial supremacy actually meant when witnessed directly rather than described in intercepted reports. Hildegard, the nurse whose diary entries would later be studied by historians, recorded that evening that their leaders had told them America was weak and unwilling to make real sacrifices for victory. Yet here in this hangar, sacrifice had become invisible because it had been replaced by production. There was no desperation, no sense of straining against impossible odds. Just steady, relentless output that continued regardless of losses. What struck the prisoners most profoundly was the casual nature of everything they witnessed. Workers joked with one another between tasks, sharing cigarettes during brief breaks, wiping sweat from their foreheads with rags kept in their back pockets. They assembled aircraft the way German workers might have assembled furniture before the war, with competence but without any sense of heroic effort or maximum exertion. To the German women, who had been told that every German worker was pressed to their absolute physical and mental limits in service of the war effort, this ease seemed impossible to reconcile with the output they were seeing. How could a people who appeared so relaxed, so unmoved by what they were doing, produce such overwhelming force? The answer, though they were only beginning to grasp it, lay in the difference between a system operating at the edge of collapse and one operating well within its capacity. Germany was burning through its reserves, demanding superhuman efforts because it had no other choice. America was working efficiently without strain because its resources allowed it to maintain sustainable production levels. O'Brien, noticing the awe and confusion written plainly on the prisoners' faces, leaned closer to the interpreter with a broad grin and told them that if they thought this hangar was impressive, they should see Detroit. He laughed and explained that this facility represented nothing but a drop in the bucket, an insignificant fraction of total American aircraft production. Then he walked away whistling, leaving the women standing in silence among the bombers, trying to process what they had just heard. The paradox could not have been more stark or more devastating to their understanding. For the Reich, every aircraft lost in combat represented a national tragedy, a precious resource that could not easily be replaced. For America, it was an inconvenience remedied within 72 hours. That single difference in perspective, that gulf between scarcity and abundance, signalled the war's inevitable trajectory more clearly than any battlefield victory or defeat could have. As the women were led back out into the fading afternoon sunlight, the roar of an engine test firing shook the ground beneath their feet with such force that several of them stumbled. The sound followed them onto the buses like a physical presence, rattling in their bones and echoing in their skulls like a prophecy they could no longer avoid hearing. But their education in American industrial capacity was still not complete. In the weeks ahead, they would be shown something even harder to deny or dismiss, something that would make the abstract concept of air power concrete and undeniable. They would see photographs and reports documenting American bombing campaigns, evidence that this industrial might was not merely theoretical or potential, but was reaching deep into the heartland of the Reich with devastating and methodical precision. 3 weeks passed in a strange rhythm of captivity that felt increasingly surreal. The camp settled into routines that became almost comfortable. Meals arrived at regular intervals, medical checks were conducted weekly, and supervised recreation periods allowed the women to walk in designated areas and breathe fresh air. By this point, the German prisoners no longer startled at the sound of American trucks rumbling past, or jumped when orders were barked in English. They had grown accustomed to the rhythms of their confinement. But the moment that would alter their understanding most profoundly did not come from witnessing something in person or experiencing it through their senses. It came instead from what they were shown preserved on paper and film. One morning in early November, they were gathered in a small meeting hall where US intelligence officers had laid out photographs across several long wooden tables. The images were printed in black and white, crisp and clinical in their detail, and utterly devastating in what they revealed. They showed German cities photographed from the air, industrial facilities captured before and after bombing raids, rail junctions torn apart into useless wreckage, synthetic fuel plants cracked open and destroyed as thoroughly as though a giant had stepped on them. This particular facility, explained one officer in measured tones, pointing with a wooden stick to a photograph of the Leuna works near Merseburg, produced a substantial portion of Germany's aviation fuel. Or rather, he added without inflection, it used to produce fuel before it was systematically destroyed. The photograph beside the first showed twisted metal frameworks, shattered pipelines spilling their contents onto scorched earth, and enormous plumes of black smoke frozen in mid-rise by the camera's shutter. The women leaned over the tables in heavy silence, their eyes moving from image to image. They had been told through Nazi broadcasts and official pronouncements that Allied bombing was random and ineffective, that enemy aircraft dropped their payloads wildly without accuracy, causing civilian casualties but failing to significantly damage Germany's war-making capacity. Yet here was photographic evidence of something entirely different. This was precise, calculated, and relentlessly systematic targeting. One photograph after another reinforced the same terrible point. a ball-bearing manufacturing plant in Schweinfurt reduced to rubble so complete that no walls remained standing. Bridges across the Rhine River snapped like matchsticks, their spans dropped into the water to prevent military traffic. Rail yards in Cologne pocked with so many craters that tracks disappeared entirely, making the facilities useless for moving supplies. A prisoner named Marta whispered, almost to herself as though speaking the thought aloud might make it more bearable. So this is why our trains never arrive anymore. The realization hit her visibly, her face draining of colour as she understood that the chronic supply failures plaguing Germany were not the result of incompetence or bad luck, but of enemy action that was working exactly as intended. The statistics that accompanied these visual records confirmed what the photographs suggested. By the middle of 1944, Allied bombers were dropping more than 200,000 tons of explosives on German territory every single month. Aircraft losses were certainly high, with hundreds of planes failing to return from each major raid, but American production, those seemingly endless rows of bombers the prisoners had already seen in Virginia hangars, made such losses sustainable in ways that Germany simply could not match. The Reich, meanwhile, found itself unable to replace the fuel refineries or the machine tools or the transportation infrastructure being systematically dismantled from above. Each bombing photograph laid bare the mathematical truth of the war. Germany was bleeding out under skies it could no longer control or defend. The sensory impact remained powerful, even when transmitted through still photographs rather than direct experience. The women studied the jagged white scars of bomb craters against blackened earth, the skeletal remains of factory buildings that had once buzzed with productive activity, the geometric patterns of destruction that spoke of careful targeting rather than random violence. One prisoner wrote in her diary that evening that she could almost smell the smoke rising from the paper itself, that the images carried a weight that transcended their physical medium. What shook them most deeply was the casual efficiency with which the American officers presented this evidence. This was clearly not theatre arranged for the prisoners' psychological benefit. The officers were not gloating or making speeches about inevitable victory. They were simply conducting routine analysis, reviewing documentation that represented one small slice of a much larger ongoing campaign. To the prisoners, each photograph felt like a personal blow, evidence of their nation being systematically dismantled. To the American intelligence personnel, these were just reports in a stack of thousands, data points to be catalogued and filed. One officer, a major with greying temples and a patient demeanour, explained without malice or triumph that the Allied strategy did not require destroying everything. He pointed to various photographs as he spoke, illustrating his points. Just the fuel infrastructure, he said. Just the precision-bearing factories. Just the critical bridges and rail junctions. When those specific targets are eliminated, your armies cannot move, your aircraft cannot fly, your factories cannot produce. Everything else becomes irrelevant. His words were clinical, matter-of-fact, but to the women listening through interpretation, they carried the weight of inevitability. Ingrid wrote later that evening, struggling to articulate what she had felt during the briefing, that it was not hatred that was defeating Germany. It was arithmetic. Cold, relentless mathematics that could not be argued with or overcome through willpower or ideological conviction. The paradox remained inescapable. German propaganda had painted their enemies as reckless barbarians, as people without discipline or strategic thinking. Yet what the prisoners were seeing was the opposite, a campaign prosecuted with cold precision and backed by industrial capacity that made even massive losses acceptable within the larger calculus of victory. When the session ended and the photographs were gathered back into folders for filing, the women walked back to their barracks under a sky streaked with the white contrails of aircraft passing overhead at high altitude. For the first time since their capture, several of them found themselves feeling as though even the clouds belonged to the enemy, that the very air above them had become contested territory they no longer controlled. The Reich had told them that mastery of the skies was theirs by right. The truth, written in smoke and destruction captured on film, told a completely different story. But this new knowledge, this documentary evidence of Germany's systematic destruction, carried with it a moral dilemma that was beginning to weigh on several of the prisoners. Should they maintain silence about what they had learned, protecting the comfortable illusions that their families and friends back home still clung to? Or should they attempt to speak the truth, risking accusations of defeatism or even treason? That question would be forced into the open by the arrival of a smuggled letter, a communication that would test both their loyalty to the dying Reich and the Americans' willingness to expose uncomfortable truths. The letter materialized on a grey afternoon in late November, slipped beneath the door of the barracks like contraband, appearing as though by magic, though everyone knew it must have passed through multiple hands to reach them. It bore no official postal markings, only a faint pencil notation in one corner that indicated it had originated from another German prisoner facility somewhere in the American Midwest. Hildegard, the nurse who had become an informal leader among the women, picked it up first with cautious fingers, turning it over to examine both sides before carefully unfolding the paper inside. When she began reading aloud in German, the other women gathered around her in a tight circle, drawn together like moths orbiting a flame. The message was brief, written in hurried script that suggested the author had been working quickly, perhaps worried about discovery. The words urged them to hold fast and maintain faith. It claimed that the Reich was mounting successful counter-offensives on all fronts, that new weapons were being prepared that would fundamentally change the course of the war, that victory was still within reach if only they refused to believe what their American captors showed them. The words echoed the same promises and reassurances they had heard countless times before their capture, the same narrative that had sustained them through years of war. Yet now, after witnessing the Norfolk shipyards and the endless highways and the aircraft hangars and the photographic evidence of systematic bombing, those sentences rang hollow in a way they could not have months earlier. The letter's tone of desperation spoke louder than its actual content, revealing more through what it tried to conceal than through what it said explicitly. Lotta, the radio operator who had maintained a skeptical pragmatism throughout their captivity, shook her head slowly as Hildegard finished reading. She stated what several others were thinking but hesitant to say aloud. If Germany were truly winning, if the situation were under control, there would be no need to smuggle letters between prison camps trying to shore up morale. The very existence of this communication suggested panic rather than confidence. But Hildegard pressed the paper flat on the rough wooden table, her expression troubled as she struggled with competing impulses. She pointed out that regardless of what they had learned here in captivity, this letter represented what their families were still being told back in the Reich, the narrative that their loved ones were clinging to for hope. What if their families believed these promises, while the prisoners, thousands of miles away, had come to know something else entirely? The moral weight of that knowledge gap pressed down on all of them. That evening, an American lieutenant who had been one of the officers presenting the bombing photographs addressed the group. He held the intercepted letter in his hand, making it clear that camp security had been aware of the contraband communication all along but had allowed it to reach the prisoners anyway. Speaking in careful but comprehensible German, he told them directly that they were under no obligation to believe anything he or his colleagues told them, but, he added with quiet emphasis, they should understand one fundamental truth. American forces did not need to show them fabricated evidence or constructed lies. The reality was persuasive enough on its own merits. He then produced a fresh set of photographs, even more recent than the previous briefing. These showed rail depots in Frankfurt reduced to twisted wreckage, columns of smoke rising from Hamburg that seemed to punch through cloud cover and reach into the stratosphere, industrial zones in the Ruhr Valley that had been transformed into lunar landscapes of craters and rubble. The contrast between the hopeful desperation of the smuggled letter and the stark documentation spread across the table could not have been more pronounced or more devastating. For the first time since arriving at the camp, one of the prisoners who had maintained complete silence for weeks finally spoke up. Greta, a woman who had kept to herself and revealed little about her background, asked a question that cut through all the comforting narratives. She asked, with her voice trembling but clear, if Germany possessed such miraculous new weapons as the letter claimed, then why were they not stopping this destruction? She tapped the photographs with a shaking finger, pointing to the smoke and ruins that documented her homeland being systematically dismantled. Why, if victory was near, did the evidence suggest nothing but defeat? The silence that followed her question felt heavier than any guard's command or any locked door. The other women sat with that question hanging in the air, unable to provide an answer that satisfied even themselves. They knew that the top man, the Führer himself, had repeatedly promised wonder weapons that would turn the tide. They had heard about rockets and jet aircraft. But here was photographic proof that whatever weapons might exist in prototype or limited production, they were not preventing the methodical destruction of Germany's ability to wage war. That night, few of the women managed to sleep despite their physical exhaustion. The sound of distant aircraft engines from a nearby training airfield rolled through the darkness like a reminder, a constant background noise that would not let them forget what they had learned. Their dreams, when sleep finally came, were filled with images of collapsing factories and streets they remembered from childhood now cratered beyond recognition, and the nagging persistent thought that perhaps loyalty to the Reich had become nothing more than a habit rooted in fear rather than any rational assessment of reality. The smuggled letter had been intended to strengthen their faith and steel their resolve. Instead, it had cracked their certainty even further, because the gap between what the letter claimed and what they had witnessed with their own eyes had become too wide to bridge with wishful thinking. The question of what to believe no longer had easy answers or comfortable certainties. And in the weeks ahead, as American authorities began allowing carefully controlled visits to nearby towns, the contrast between propaganda and observable reality would deepen until denial became psychologically impossible to maintain. Spring arrived in 1945 with an unexpected gentleness, bringing warmth after the harsh winter and coaxing green shoots from the Virginia soil. But the season's renewal stood in stark contrast to the news that continued to filter into the prison camp with increasing frequency. The barracks that had once buzzed constantly with anxious speculation and whispered conversations grew quieter with each passing day, as though the women had collectively decided that silence was easier than trying to process the information they were receiving. Newspapers were being left deliberately in the common areas now, placed there by American officers who understood that certain truths needed to be confronted directly rather than hidden. The headlines announced the fall of German cities one after another, each name a hammer blow to whatever hope remained. Cologne had fallen. Dresden had been destroyed in firestorms that killed tens of thousands. Frankfurt was occupied. Each headline represented not just a military defeat, but the collapse of a world the women had known since childhood. By April, the whispers that circulated through the camp carried news that seemed impossible to fully comprehend, even when spoken aloud. The top man, the Führer whose name they had been conditioned to speak with reverence, was dead. The Reich that had proclaimed itself as an empire destined to endure for 1,000 years had collapsed in barely 12. The women sat on their wooden bunks in the lengthening spring evenings, staring at one another across the narrow space, unable to reconcile the world they had been raised within, the ideology that had shaped their entire adult lives, with the reality of total defeat that now surrounded them. Ingrid, who had faithfully maintained her diary throughout the months of captivity, wrote an entry that would later be preserved and studied by historians. She recorded that they had arrived in America as soldiers of a nation that believed itself destined to reshape Europe according to its vision. Now, she continued, she could see clearly that they had been nothing more than children fed elaborate stories and appealing lies, while America had been constructing a world that operated beyond their comprehension or their ability to compete with it. The US Army began making preparations for repatriation, the complex process of returning prisoners to their homeland now that hostilities had officially ended. The women were issued clean uniforms to replace their worn-out clothing, given thorough medical examinations to ensure they were healthy enough for travel, and provided with rations sufficient for the ocean voyage that would carry them back across the Atlantic. Some wept openly at the prospect of seeing their families again after months or years of separation. Others feared what awaited them in a defeated, starving, occupied Germany where the certainties they had once relied upon no longer existed. For all of them, the journey carried a haunting paradox that was impossible to ignore. They were leaving behind the comfort and predictable order they had found in the land they had been taught to think of as the enemy, returning instead to chaos and deprivation in what had once been their homeland. Before their departure, a Red Cross officer approached Ingrid with an unusual request that had apparently been the subject of some debate among American authorities. She was being given the opportunity to carry a message home, not a personal letter to family, but rather an official report that would be transmitted through proper channels to whatever remained of German civil administration. Washington had spent considerable time weighing the risks. Would such a report be immediately dismissed as enemy propaganda, or could it possibly serve some purpose in demonstrating to German authorities the complete futility of any continued resistance? Ingrid's account was deliberately kept brief but unflinching in its assessment. She wrote that America's strength was not propaganda or exaggeration or a clever deception. It was everywhere and undeniable. It existed in their machines and their factories and their agricultural abundance and their communications networks. It was visible in their unity of purpose. To continue any form of armed resistance against such overwhelming capacity, she concluded, was not patriotism, but madness. When the transport ship carrying the repatriated prisoners finally docked at Bremerhaven in early summer, Ingrid's report was dutifully transmitted up through what remained of the German administrative chain of command. The reaction from the officers who read it was entirely predictable and deeply frustrating. They dismissed it almost immediately, labelling Ingrid as either a traitor who had been turned by enemy propaganda or as a gullible woman who had been deceived by American theatrical displays designed specifically to break prisoner morale. The truth she was trying to communicate was simply too large and too threatening to fit into the ideological framework that these men still clung to, even in defeat. But for the women themselves, for the 47 individuals who had made that journey and witnessed things their training had not prepared them to see, the truth could not be erased or conveniently forgotten. They had observed aircraft being produced faster than they could be destroyed in combat. They had eaten meals more substantial and nutritious than their own families could access. They had walked through towns where children played in streets without fear of bombs falling from the sky at any moment. They had seen the physical infrastructure of a nation that had fought a two-ocean war while simultaneously maintaining domestic prosperity. What they carried back to Germany in their memories was not just data or intelligence, but something more fundamental and more disturbing to their previous understanding of the world. They brought back the ability to make comparisons, a living contradiction to everything the Reich had promised them about racial superiority and inevitable victory. They had been told that will and discipline would overcome material disadvantages. They had learned instead that will without resources was simply desperation dressed up in appealing rhetoric. Years would pass before some of these women felt comfortable speaking openly about their experiences to children and grandchildren. When they finally did share their stories, they did not describe their time as American prisoners in terms of humiliation or suffering. Instead, they spoke of it as an awakening, a period when carefully constructed illusions had been systematically dismantled by the simple weight of observable reality. They recalled the specific details that had made the deepest impressions. The sound of hundreds of hammers striking steel plates in Norfolk Harbour, creating a rhythm that never stopped. The seemingly endless rows of tanks and trucks moving along Virginia highways. The casual abundance visible in every warehouse and depot they passed. The freedom of communication they had overheard in every radio transmission and telephone conversation. These were not impressions that could be dismissed or explained away by anyone who had genuinely witnessed them. No photograph or speech or propaganda film could erase the direct sensory experience of seeing American industrial capacity functioning at a scale that made German efforts seem almost quaint by comparison. The women had arrived in October of 1944, expecting to find a soft nation on the verge of collapse, a people unwilling to make the sacrifices necessary for victory. They had departed months later, having learned that the opposite was true in every measurable way. In the final accounting, when historians would later analyse the factors that had led to Germany's total defeat, they would point to many causes: the opening of multiple fronts, the strategic errors made by leadership, the moral bankruptcy of an ideology built on hatred and conquest. But for these particular women who had seen it firsthand, America's greatest weapon was not any particular technology or any specific battlefield innovation. It was abundance itself. It was the seemingly bottomless capacity to produce and create, backed by the political will to sustain that production for as long as necessary. It was a system where freedom, when properly organized and directed, could outbuild any tyranny. This was not propaganda or exaggeration, or a story designed to make them feel better about defeat. This was simply the reality they had observed with their own eyes, heard with their own ears, tasted with their own tongues during those months of captivity. They had gone to America as representatives of what they believed was a superior system. They returned having been forced to function as students, learning lessons their government had tried desperately to prevent them from understanding. The education had been thorough and undeniable. In the contest between democracy and dictatorship, between a society that valued individual liberty and one built on rigid control, the victor had been decided not on the battlefield alone, but in the factories and shipyards and communication networks of a nation that proved it could sustain both prosperity and war simultaneously.